Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States, a nation built on the foundation of equal representation and fair treatment under the law. But the people of D.C. have neither. Despite having a population greater than 2 U.S. states, it has no voting representation in the House or the Senate. Not only that, but it's subjected to the highest federal taxes per capita, which is why you see "end taxation without representation" on D.C. license plates. Because D.C. is a district, not a state, the federal government, which it has no say in, has complete control over its legislation, laws, and budget. Congress often blocks D.C.'s local laws and budgetary changes just because it doesn't align with their own political agenda, despite not even living there. So D.C. lacks the basic autonomy seen everywhere else in the country, is constantly being meddled with by the federal government, is taxed more than anywhere else in the country, and has no vote in Congress to even begin to change this. This is the basic motivation behind the D.C. statehood movement, which is a centuries-long effort to establish Washington, D.C. as a U.S. state. Legislation for establishing D.C. statehood has been presented to Congress many times, most recently in 2020, where it was passed in the House by a vote of 232 to 180. This plan would have shrunk the federal capital district to just the downtown area where no one lives, establishing the rest of D.C. as the 51st state, known as the Douglas Commonwealth. If this were to pass, D.C. would have been granted statehood, and the seat of government still wouldn't reside within a state, which is in line with the Constitution. All but one Democrat voted in favor, and the legislation had the strong support of the Speaker of the House and the House Majority Leader. But it was stalled in the Republican-controlled Senate when Majority Leader Mitch McConnell refused to bring it to a vote. I myself am a fourth-generation Washingtonian, and I've been living here my whole life. I think a lot of people who don't live here have this misconception that D.C. is just the seat of government and only, politicians live here or something. They don't realize that we're an American city just like any other, with over 2 centuries of complex history and culture, and over 700,000 residents. They only see the monuments and downtown, and have no idea what the real D.C. is actually like. This perception probably plays a role in the denial of our statehood, as many Americans are quick to dismiss us because they're ignorant to our lives and culture. But this video isn't so much about DC culture, it's about the city's long history of fighting for equal rights. I'll talk about how and why our city has been mistreated by the federal government over the years, often for racist reasons, and try to give the most complete explanation of the issue as I can. Well, here are some of the most common arguments I hear against statehood, and I'll concisely refute each of them. It's important to understand that DC statehood is in no way a new movement. It's the continued fight for equality Washingtonians have fought for centuries, but it's always been held back by racism and an abuse of federal power. It goes all the way back to the establishment of the Capitol in December 1800. In the months following this, Congress seized total control over the region, abolishing local elections and completely disenfranchising the several thousand established residents of the new capital who lived there previously. In January 1801, a public meeting was held by the citizens of D.C. where they stated, "We shall be completely disenfranchised in respect to the national government, while we retain no security for participating in the formation of even the most minute local regulations by which we are to be affected. We shall be reduced to that deprecated condition of which we pathetically complained in our charges against Great Britain, of being taxed without representation." This issue was raised when D.C. was first founded over 200 years ago, and we are still saying this today. Thankfully, total disenfranchisement didn't last too long, as Washingtonians gained more autonomy in the coming decades, and by 1820, they had the power to elect a mayor. From 1820 to 1871, Washingtonians would have relative autonomy, but they would lose it and not have it again for over 100 years. In the aftermath of the Civil War, D.C. became a destination for freed slaves, staying or immigrating for the voting rights and government jobs that were available here. Black men would account for 1/3 of the overall voting population, but conservatives in Congress feared the new voters in D.C. would elect black or black-supporting leaders, and quickly removed D.C.'s mayoral system in 1871. They can do that kind of thing because they have absolute power over the city. In its place, the commissioner system was established. And under this system, instead of a democratically elected mayor and city council, the city was now under the control of 3 federally appointed commissioners. This system was in place for a century. Meanwhile, D.C. became known as Chocolate City because its population grew to be majority black. But governing Chocolate City was three white guys who weren't from here, appointed by the president who wasn't from here, implemented to serve the political agenda of Congress who weren't from here. At this time, the United States was implementing and often enforcing its democratic ideals around the world, but democracy was absent from its own capital city. Washingtonians had no say on who governed them locally, executively, or legislatively. They were, to quote Frederick Douglass, treated as aliens, not citizens, but subjects. He said that in 1881, by the way, kind of crazy it's still true to this day. And these commissioners often went against the interest of Washingtonians. For example, in the 1940s, they built numerous freeways that destroyed many minority and low-income neighborhoods, displacing tens of thousands of people by 1960. This decision was made by the commissioners and some Southern congressmen, despite being nearly unanimously hated by the actual residents of DC, who of course had no home rule and therefore no say in this. As activist Matt Andreas said, "In the eyes of these congressmen, the city was expendable. They had little regard for the people who lived here." It was only thanks to a massive protest movement in the late 60s that the city was prevented from being destroyed farther, and the much more convenient and cheaper metro system was built. This is actually a pretty amazing story, so I'll link a couple articles on this in the description if you want to learn more. But why was DC treated like this, and why did it take so long to start to fix? Well, like many bad things in American history, it was largely because of racism. DC was majority black, so giving any political power to DC meant giving political power to black people, something racist white guys in Congress obviously did not want. In 1878, a Washington Post editorial stated, "The present form of alien government is about as bad as to be devised, but a system which gives control of the district to ignorant and depraved Negroes is still worse." Yeah. And this continued throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 1930s, Mississippi Representative Ross A. Collins cut spending on local funds for welfare and education, saying, "My constituents wouldn't stand for spending money on, yeah." These are just a couple examples, but you get the idea. For as long as DC has existed, people in the federal government have abused their power and subjugated the people of DC to push their often racist political agendas. And as Chocolate City, the first majority black city in the country, denying Washington's vote is suppressing black voices. It's as simple as that. But after a century of fighting against total disenfranchisement, DC was finally granted the ability to vote in the presidential election by the 23rd Amendment in 1961 and gained home rule in 1973. Washingtonians could now elect their own mayor and city council, but there was still a long way to go. Congress still controlled everything else. That means our laws, our budget, and pretty much every decision made by our elected officials still needed to be directly approved by Congress and were often shut down. A Congress we of course still had no representation in. Home rule still wasn't even guaranteed from there on out, however, nor did it truly give Washingtonians power over the city. In the late 80s and early 90s, the crack epidemic was rampant in DC, causing murder rates to skyrocket and leaving the city as the murder capital of the world. But why did it get so bad? Well, there were a lot of factors, but it was in large part because DC was powerless to do anything to stop it. Any local solutions, such as building treatment centers that could help combat the issue, were struck down by the Reagan and Bush administrations. Instead, like many cities in the US, the war on drugs decimated the black population and perpetuated the problem. Congress even temporarily removed home rule again in 1997 when Mayor for Life Marion Barry was elected into his fourth term. Yet again, they seized direct control of the city's services, finances, and laws, and stripped Barry of almost all his power in what he called a rape of democracy. He declined to run for a fifth term, knowing Congress wouldn't restore full home rule while he was in office. To put it simply, Congress didn't like Marion Barry, so they just stripped away all of his power and the power of Washingtonians yet again to seize control over the city. There's this never-ending cycle when it comes to DC autonomy, where Congress doesn't let DC run themselves, and as a result, the city's conditions worsen. Congress then uses these bad conditions as a patronizing excuse for why they won't give us autonomy. This is a cycle that's been going on for as long as DC has existed. And I'm not blaming every problem DC has on the federal government. Our city, like all other cities, is far from perfect. But unlike other cities, DC's ability to correct its problems is heavily impeded by the political agendas of those in Congress. And this has always been the case. Although we've been given more autonomy over the years, Congress can take it all away at any point, and has several times in the past. To make things worse, we have no representation in Congress, so there's nothing we can really do about it. The only real escape from the constant disenfranchisement, unwanted intervening, impediments to our progress, high federal taxes, and lack of representation is statehood. People need to understand that DC statehood is not a Democrat power grab, as many Republican politicians like to label it. It is a centuries-long fight for the basic rights every other American citizen has. The only power grab is the continued denial of these basic rights and the silencing of over 700,000 people to push one party's political agenda. Okay, so while I was editing this video, there was another pretty awful development. On February 6, 2025, Utah Senator Mike Lee and Tennessee Representative Andy Ogles proposed a bill to remove DC's home rule again. They claim that DC's right to democracy should be removed to stop the corruption, crime, and incompetence in our government, specifically citing rising carjackings in the city, which is just flat out not true. Violent crime rates actually recently hit a 30-year low. Carjackings are down by 48%, and armed carjackings are down by 52%. They talk about recent corruption charges against Councilmember Trayon White, even though he was removed from office. But these congressmen obviously don't care about objective facts. This is just a very thinly veiled attempt to remove our right to democracy, just like the countless attempts in the past, despite it frankly being none of their business. President Trump gave his full support to this bill as well, as he's been very clear in the past about his intentions to seize control of our city, even saying he planned on bringing in the National Guard to curb these imaginary rising crime rates. As long as DC is not a state, we have no protection from anti-democracy politicians like these, and our basic rights will always be in jeopardy. So with that being said, I really hope this doesn't go through, because that's all I or any Washingtonian can do in these situations. Now, back to the video. But how is all of this justified in Congress? What excuses do Republican representatives use for the denial of our rights? Well, here are some of the most common arguments I've heard against statehood, and I will go through and quickly give my counter-argument to each of them. DC statehood is unconstitutional, or it goes against the Founding Fathers. This refers to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution, which established DC as a non-voting, federally controlled district not exceeding 10 miles square. But nothing in the current plan would even combat this. There would still be a federally controlled capital district that holds the seat of government and is less than 10 square miles in area. It just wouldn't disenfranchise 700,000 people in the process. In fact, 39 leading constitutional scholars said in a letter to Congress in 2021 that there is no constitutional barrier to DC entering the Union, just like the 37 other states that have been admitted since the Constitution was adopted. But even if it did go against the Constitution, or what the Founding Fathers believed somehow, that really shouldn't be the end of the conversation. The Founding Fathers also thought that only white, landowning men should vote. They were content with slavery and could never imagine a non-white, non-Protestant in office. The Founding Fathers were smart men, but they also lived over 200 years ago. And things change over the course of 200 years. Only a few thousand lived in DC back in 1800, but now it has a population greater than 2 states. The word of the Constitution and the Founding Fathers is not an absolute truth, which is why we've amended said Constitution 26 times. Laws can always change and should do so to better represent modern times. A state shouldn't have control over the capital. So this is similar to what I just said, but it points to the Constitution saying that the seat of government shouldn't lie within a state. But again, giving DC statehood wouldn't even go against this. The seat of government would still be in a federal district, not a state. But even if this wasn't the case, what exactly do you think will happen if the capital is a state? We wouldn't have any more control over the federal government, they would just have less control over us. Making DC a state wouldn't ruin our country, it would make us just like every other country in the world. No other nation excludes their capital from statehood or a statehood equivalent, and well, they're doing just fine. I understand the reasoning the Founding Fathers had for this, but this law just doesn't apply to a modern DC and a modern America. Some also argue that we don't deserve statehood because we don't have enough production or somehow aren't self-sustaining enough as a city, but this simply isn't true. The vast majority of our budget comes from local taxes, not federal money, and not only are we federally taxed more per capita than any state, but we are also a donor state, meaning we actually give more federal tax dollars than we receive, which can't be said about the majority of US states. But even if this wasn't the case, why does that matter exactly? And how would being a state make this a problem? It's almost like they're just making up arbitrary criteria for statehood for the sole purpose of denying ours. Other cities like New York and LA would get statehood next. No, they wouldn't. They're already in the state, so none of this applies to them. They don't need statehood, so they wouldn't get it. Just join Maryland. Now, this is suggested by a lot of people who don't live here. They think that since Maryland ceded land for the creation of DC over 200 years ago, we should just give the land back to them. But there's a problem. No one in DC or Maryland wants this. DC and Maryland have been politically and culturally separate for centuries, and trying to merge them would mess up, well, a lot of things. The political balances of the state would be upset, and Maryland wouldn't even be able to effectively represent us anyway. Statehood is just a much better and easier alternative that is actually wanted by the people who live in the area. Why should the majority suffer for the needs of the few? Now, we hear this a lot from people when arguing for statehood, and they say that DC's population is too small, so the rest of the country shouldn't have to cater to them. But isn't promoting local power over federal power a fundamental principle of the Republican Party? Don't you think applying these values everywhere in the US, besides the city that's majority Democrats, seems a little hypocritical? Look, we're not asking for much, just the same rights as everywhere else. And the only suffering would be experiencing our proper democracy without ignoring 700,000 citizens. The current plan would leave the president with 3 electoral votes. So this is referring to a snag in the current plan for statehood having to do with the 23rd Amendment. As I said before, if the plan were to go into action, the federal district would be restrained to just the federal government buildings in downtown DC. The state of DC would consist of every part of the city besides the small district. But there is one problem with this. Technically, the president and his family would be the only residents of this district, and under the 23rd Amendment, this district would have 3 electoral votes in presidential elections. This means that through this technicality, the presidential family would have these 3 votes entirely to themselves. Now, this would be a hiccup which may require the 23rd Amendment to be changed or repealed, but it's really not as big of a deal as Republicans are making it sound. It could be a bit more work, and it might have to be done before an election cycle, but using this loophole as a way to somehow justify the disenfranchisement of 700,000 people seems insane. A snag in this specific plan doesn't mean that we don't deserve statehood. That's like saying people don't deserve food because there might be some trouble making it. But even with all of that said, none of it really matters. It doesn't matter how good our reasons for statehood are because Republicans probably will never let it happen anyway for one simple reason. It would mean another Democrat representative in the House and another 2 in the Senate. And this could tip the scales of political power to the left, and of course no one on the right wants this. This is the main and arguably only reason we have never been granted statehood, and probably never will anytime soon. I would even go as far as to say that all of the counter-arguments I mentioned earlier are not reasons for our disenfranchisement, but justification for it. Republicans obviously don't want more Democrats in Congress, so they come up with all of these excuses for their continued denial of our American rights. The unfortunate truth is that no matter how much we push for statehood and how little sense our disenfranchisement makes, people in government tend to really only care about themselves or their state. No member of Congress will grant DC statehood if they think it will hurt their party's power. This means that to become a state, we'll likely have to wait until there's a Democrat majority in the House and Senate, as well as the Democrat president. So until that happens, all we can really do is keep spreading awareness and keep making bills that hopefully someday Congress will pass. With that being said though, I don't want you to think that it's a hopeless cause. It's certainly a difficult, long-running battle, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. I know it seems like I've been very accusing of Republicans in this video, but understand that I was just referring to Republicans in Congress that have repeatedly denied our rights, not everyone in the party. Of course, there are Republicans that put common sense over their political biases, and we need their help too to help achieve our goal. Really, there is nothing partisan about the right to govern oneself and ending taxation without representation. These are things that both parties agree are fundamental American rights, but simply because our city was mostly black or is mostly Democrats, people in Congress have turned it into a partisan issue, needlessly making us the exception. But obviously, it should never have been about race or party or anything like that. It is just a simple, glaring break of the American promise to over 700,000 people with a simple, obvious solution. We just need to keep on spreading awareness of the issue so that we can get support from people around the country, people from both parties, which I think is my main motivation for making this video. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Statehood is something I'm passionate about, and this is a video I've wanted to make for a while now. I originally did most of the research and script back in my senior year of high school, but never had the chance to finish it until now. I've put some articles and sources in the description if you're interested in learning more, and I really hope you learned something new. Feel free to leave a comment if you want us to support or have any questions, or just want to start like a pointless argument, because I'm always down for that. And also, I may be making another video on this topic in the future with perhaps some special guests, so keep an eye out for that. And thank you.